Ms. Snyder, thanks for coming in. I appreciate your help today with having a chance to be able to get into your classroom and view your history for American history class. Can you tell me a little bit about what I'll be seeing in your lesson today?
So the lesson that the students are going to be doing, they're going to be answering the historical question, why the U.S. entered World War I. And it's a lesson that is modified from a SHEG, Stanford History Education Group, a lesson that they put together. And so the students will be using historical thinking skills to answer that question in a written format. So they'll be writing a thesis statement with evidence to support it.
Right, it's quite extensive. Tell me a little about the SHEG. I know you went this last summer to Stanford to learn a little about how to run this and implement this in a classroom. And you've taught this in the past, earlier this this year. I'm curious to see when you're utilizing these types of strategies in your classroom, are you finding a big difference as far as really having the kids go to a deeper level of understanding of material?
And so the premise around SHEG and what's kind of drew me to it is that it's not just, we're not memorizing just a list of facts, that it's actually these skills that students, whether they're professional historians or if they're working wherever, a lawyer, doctor, anything like that, they're these skills that the students will actually utilize in their lives. And so within that, the students are going to be going through primary and secondary sources, doing some sourcing, doing contextualization, doing some close reading, and then corroborating across those sources to come up with their actual answer to the question. So it involves both content information as well as historical skills, which we as a department believe that that's a foundational skill that students need to leave with, so it's something that they're assessed on and that we continually work on throughout the entire quarter.
So it sounds like the kids are very immersed in the material. It's not just this sit and get, it's not this really taking in and being a part of, immersed with the material versus just kind of, like you said, memorizing and learning a list of terms that maybe they lose after the unit's completed. How do you know if the kids know at the end of the unit?
Well,
or at the end of the lesson item, sorry.
And students are going to go through, they'll be looking at a few different primary sources, answering some questions, some guided questions that take them through those historical thinking skills. Then they'll take a look at a Howard Zinn reading that's a more contemporary secondary source. And they'll be corroborating that all together to create a paragraph where they have to write a thesis statement and then back it up using specific pieces of evidence taken from those three documents. And you know, we've worked a lot on so far in just our one unit that we've worked on how do we write an effective and a persuasive thesis statement, how do we actually take specific evidence, citing which document and which authors are giving us that evidence. And putting that all together in a paragraph. And so the students will, at the very end of the lesson, they will type that up on our Schoology page and post that in a discussion post. So I can go through and quickly read those, give them some feedback, and let them know how they're doing and what they need to work on.
So how do you scaffold your classroom to get your kids to be at this level, to be able to really effectively using and utilizing the primary and secondary resources that you talked about? How have you flipped this in your classroom to be able to prepare those kids for this type of learning?
And so in our first lesson that we did like this, I go through and I model for them exactly what you do when you source. They have highlighters, they have the actual documents that they have hard copies in front of them, and they watch me highlight on the board and they highlight it on their actual sheet. I write the notes and kind of talk them through. I vocally talk them through what a historian would think as they're sourcing a document before they actually read it. And this was something, when I went to the SHEG conference at Stanford, they walked us through that step by step and talked about how kids don't really do this, but once they see that modeling, it's better understood. So we did that the first document. Then I let them go through and do first their own. And then I went through and modeled it again so they could kind of check themselves and see how they're doing. On our first test, they'll have tomorrow a question, that's a 5-point question on sourcing where they'll source a document and they have a question about sourcing. I'll take a look at that. So once we get into this one in our next unit, I'll have a good idea of who's kind of where everybody's at
Yeah,
and who's
yeah.
struggling a little bit more and who's really got it, so we can do some
Good.
grouping with that.
I know it's early in the quarter, we just started the third quarter and you're getting to know your class. How are you feeling that when you look at across the, your classroom of 30 plus kids, are there any concerns or when you're looking at the profiles of kids and how they learn, some of the struggling learners that maybe have already been identified,
Mm-hmm.
how do you envision differentiating or being able to work with all the different learners in your classroom?
And so I will, after the first test, I usually, and specifically that historical thinking skill question, I'll seat them with their learning partner is what I call it, the person they sit exactly by. And we'll match them up with somebody who's stronger and kind of has it with somebody who's struggling a little bit more. So those kids can model for one another as well.
And there's scaffolding between you modeling and then their peer modeling for them and then they're also involved as well, that's wonderful. Good.
And just, keeping an eye on those kids that I know are struggling more so and maybe even if I have a group or some people that really aren't understanding, assigning core time for them to come in and get that extra help on the skill that they're gonna need throughout the entire quarter.
Is there any, I guess when you're looking at what happens if they don't understand it and you're seeing even with all of those kind of checkpoints along the way, what happens if a student is not understanding or is not really kind of getting the gist of how to think like a historian different from I want to just memorize terms and isolate events?
That would be when I would assign the core time.
The core, okay.
Have them come in. I already this week had some kids who came in and got extra help because after the first one they were a little fuzzy still.
So just
and
that repetition for them.
Needed it to hear it one more time, so.
And then the students that are already getting it, that understand it, they're your teachers too, so they're able to not only understand it and work with it, but can teach others as well, so that enrichment piece of it, for them to be able to be empowered by that is nice. What are some of the tools that you're gonna help? So you talked about primary and secondary resources, the Howard Zinn.
Yep.
And then using the Schoology, so that's the place where that's the open forum where they're journaling, or writing their thesis statements, writing their paragraphs, and then people responding to that, so those are the pieces. Is there, let's see here, anything else that we're gonna think about before, so I get a good feel for anything?
Well, at the very beginning of the lesson, students I give them 3 different, for this particular one, as they're answering why is the U.S. enter World War I, I give them 3 main events, like when World War I started, when the U.S. entered, and then when Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia. And so they list out and they just simply do a Google search. And we talk a little bit about how, part of sourcing is understanding dates, but they have to do this contextualize and put it into place. And so we'll do that little activity, and that's just a quick Google search. So.
And when is this unit when is this lesson in the bigger unit?
This is a few days into the unit after we've talked about the causes of the war and
causes and then the conceptual and then we start working with it.
And so why did, we'll talk a little bit about how the U.S. doesn't enter, and so why does the U.S. finally enter?
So you've done this last term, and I'm curious, how did that go when you first instituted this into your classroom? And then are there any changes that you're already, like from that first time, looking into how you're gonna be implementing in the classroom for this time?
I found that doing these sorts of lessons, the kids really understand the history more so. I, this time, am emphasizing more so the close reading and specific language and things like that, instead of just emphasizing sourcing. Taking it instead of going through every single skill all at once, but chunking it piece by piece by piece, so they can master sourcing, and then we'll move on to kind of the next one and what does that whole piece mean.
Is there anything specific that you want me, as I come into your classroom and as you're seeing all this activity happening, what that you want me to specifically zero in on, students that you're concerned about, that you want me to watch for their engagement? Anything specific?
I would say just making sure, because a big piece of this is that every single kid is actually engaged in history,
Okay.
that, and it's not they're dozing off or staring off into
Right.
into space, that everybody's engaged, so just making sure that every single student is actively engaged, that they're part of the process.
And what would that look like when you're seeing, so if you're as a teacher
Mhm.
and viewing this lesson, what would that look like when you're seeing an actively engaged classroom?
Well, they have their packet of questions right in front of them, they've got their documents in front of them, they also have highlighters and pencils or pens too. And so that they're highlighting, they're making notes actually on their documents, which is an active part of the process. That they're going back and forth between their documents and their questions and the charts and their graphic organizers that they're gonna be filling in. But that they're doing
Yeah.
all of those different things.
Great. Well, I am very excited to come into a classroom that is so involving the student in the learning of you not having to be the expert, but they can start piecemealing things together and really be that kind of investigator of what happened and ultimately come up with their thesis statement that you mentioned. So very excited about coming into the classroom. Thank you for allowing me to come in, and we'll talk after the lesson to kind of look over how it all went.
Perfect.
Thanks, Kelsey.